Hello everyone, thanks for waiting and welcome to this week's Roundtable discussion. I'm Eva Cahill and I'll be hosting this week's Roundtable. So far, these panels, we've covered a huge range of topics, from the shocking, unregulated and illegal fishing taking place in our high seas, to dissecting the chartered rights granted to the River Wye. These and many more are all available to watch back on our Spotify channel and on demand on our website. But this week, we'll be looking more closely at the marine heatwaves facing our British and European seas. We've experienced 3 heatwaves this summer in Europe, with temperatures tracking at over 30 degrees Celsius for over 25 days this year so far. And while human health has suffered massively in this extreme heat, so too has the ocean. The Met Office also confirmed that Britain is facing its 3rd and most intense marine heatwave this year, which puts temperatures at levels usually expected in August, averaging around 2 degrees centigrade warmer than usual, with some parts of offshore English and Welsh coasts running about 4 to 5 degrees above normal. Forecasters have warned it could tip into Category 4 extreme status, and this has followed an unprecedented land heatwave driven by climate change and a heat dome that stalled over Europe, which has left the sea surface little chance to cool. This also sits within a wider global pattern. Copernicus confirmed global sea surface temperatures surpassed previous records for this time of year set in 2023 and 2024, following the onset of El Niño conditions in the Pacific. Warmer seas stress ecosystems like kelp forests and have the potential to cause mass species die-off among fish, and they are also related to the influx of unusual fish and jellyfish blooms and octopus moving en masse into the waters around Devon and Cornwall. So what will happen in our local seas in future as our ocean suffers increasing pressures from these marine heat waves? And how will coastal ecosystems across our country change? How can we better equip our ecosystems to be resilient to these changes? And how do we slow global warming to ensure these heat waves don't just keep getting worse and worse? Well, thankfully, I don't have to answer all those questions myself over the course of the next 40 minutes. We have some fantastic panelists joining us to give us their specific insight into these problems. First, we are joined by Dr. Zoe Jacobs, a biogeochemical ocean modeller at the National Oceanography Centre in Southampton. Zoe has spent over a decade using a mix of advanced computer models and satellite data to see exactly how ocean life and productivity respond to climate stress. While our past work is focused on tropical systems like the Western Indian Ocean, she's currently tracking our unfolding crisis in the UK and recently co-authored a massive national roadmap identifying 40 priority research questions for UK marine heatwaves. Zoe, it's wonderful to have you here with us.
Thank you so much.
Next, we have Dr. Katie Smith, a postdoctoral career development fellow and marine ecologist at the Marine Biological Association in Plymouth. Working within the benthic ecosystems and environmental change group, Katie has spent over 10 years diving into how marine communities adapt, or rather don't adapt, to environmental stresses from the tropics to the poles. Her current focus is bridging the gap between ecology and society, looking specifically at the socio-economic and supply chain impacts when these heat rays disrupt our coastal ecosystems. Katie, thanks for joining us.
Hi, thanks for being here.
And finally, we have Brian O'Donnell, the director of the Campaign for Nature, an ambitious global initiative backed by the WISP Foundation. Brian has spent more than 2 decades leading massive public lands, wilderness and wildlife preservation campaigns across the globe. And today he's one of the leading voices steering the 30 by 30 framework, the policy to push to legally protect at least 30% of the planet's land and oceans by 2030. Brian focuses heavily on the finance, informants and human rights frameworks needed to make sure these protections actually work. Brian, a very warm welcome to you as well.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
As always, if you have any questions for our experts, please do leave them in the chat bar on the right. But first, I'm going to stop talking and hand over to the experts. Zoe, the Met Office indicates we could be tipping into Category 4 extreme marine heatwave in the UK. But what does this kind of mean? What does an extreme heat wave mean, and what does it mean for our oceans?
Yeah, so I'll start from at the beginning, thinking about the basics of that. So just like we have heat waves on land, we do get them in the ocean as well, and they're just periods of extremely warm temperatures compared to normal for that specific time of year and for that particular region. So they can occur in quite localized regions and small pockets, or they can cover huge portions of ocean basins and can last for about a week or even up to months in some extreme cases. And you said, so we're thinking about those kind of extreme marine heat wave categories there. So we have 4 categories. The first is thinking about the 90th percentile. So marine heat waves are defined statistically. So we're thinking about what's happening compared to a 30-year baseline. And that difference, we start going above the kind of different percentiles. So basically extreme just means that's basically the highest category that we have for our marine heat waves, which is very unusual for British waters. We did actually experience a few pockets of waters that went into the extreme category, but at the moment I think we are firmly back into category 2 to 3 at the moment.
And coming to you, Katie, looking at that extreme kind of heat on our oceans or extreme categorization, what kind of effect do we actually have on the local ecosystems we have in our seas, and what can we anticipate going forward into the future?
So as Zoe was just saying, I think it must be about a week ago, we did hit this extreme category, and it was the water all the way from the UK coast all the way across the Channel down to France and Spain was hitting in that highest category. We're kind of in a fortunate spot here where we don't see around the UK waters too many negative impacts. So we're actually seeing a bit of an increase in more warm water species than we would normally see. Yes, we've experienced quite a lot of jellyfish and jellyfish stings down in the southwest, certainly. We're seeing more tuna, we're seeing lots of dolphin sightings, things like that. But we don't, compared to lots of other parts of the world, we don't yet experience the negative side of marine heat waves. That said, that's probably what's to come. And in lots of other parts, we see, total loss of kelp forests and seagrass beds, coral bleaching, fisheries stock being hit really dramatically to the point where entire fisheries industries are having to close, et cetera, loads of different things.
So our colder water species in the UK are currently still kind of managing to deal with these warmer seas, but looking forward to the future, they might be more stressed.
Exactly that. And certainly if you look at things like fishery species, we are seeing a movement north. So we're seeing species kind of tracking our changing temperatures. Those that can move are tracking the changing temperatures. There is some reporting of intertidal areas, so the area that sits, exposed to land and sea heat waves, bleaching of some of the different plants and things on there. So yeah, the negative impacts we'll see are going to be more the species that can't move. Those that can move are moving northward to kind of stay in water temperatures that are comfortable for them.
And just to come back to you quickly, Zoe, we've obviously got the El Nino this year, which is set to increase water temperatures. But are these marine heat waves like a one-off? Is this an extreme climate event, or was this a continuation of a trend we're going to keep seeing? And can you give us a bit more sense on the data on that?
Yeah, so as Katie was saying, we haven't really experienced any kind of major impacts from marine heat waves around the UK yet. I mean, we've always experienced them because they're defined statistically, but maybe they've not been as kind of long or intense or as impactful as other regions around the world. In saying that, we had our first major event, I guess I would call it, in June 2023, which was a short, sharp event. And then we had another one last year in 2025, which was longer and more intense in some places. And then again, we're getting another one this summer, which has been ongoing in some parts, particularly in the English Channel. It's been going on pretty much for the entire year so far. And it's only intensified after those successive atmospheric heat waves that you mentioned at the start. So it kind of does look like this is becoming our new normal, if you like. Obviously with emissions still rising, the background warming is continuing. So it's just likely that we're going to see more extremes, and those extremes could be more extreme than we're used to. And as you say, we're having this the El Nino that's developing at the moment. So what happens with an El Nino is it's the year after that you would expect to see a rise in the global temperatures. And then obviously there could be pockets of extremes on top of that as well. So whilst we don't know, it's too far ahead at the moment, there is quite a strong chance that we could see another one in our waters next year.
Which is quite worrying given, I guess, the adverse impacts they can have. But Brian, you're on this panel, you're all the way over in America, in Colorado, and providing a slightly more globalized lens. And it'd be great to hear from you a bit more about, the constructive things we can do to make sure that our ecosystems are more resilient. And so you work specifically more on the 30 by 30 target. It would be great to hear from you a bit more about how that policy framework can help give these ecosystems a chance against the rising marine heat that we've heard about from Katie and Zoe.
Sure. When we look at the state of the ocean right now, only about 10% of it is in some sort of protection, and even a lesser percentage of it is strictly protected. But those protections are very important for ocean resilience. First of all, they are providing habitat for marine species. We heard from some of the other panelists about how with the warmer temperatures and heat waves, we're seeing a movement of fish. And so if we only have a small percentage of the ocean protected, as these species move, they're going to become more vulnerable in places that aren't protected. So we need to make sure we have a truly representative and large enough system of marine protected areas to ensure that we can maintain this diversity of marine biodiversity across the world. Marine protected areas protect things like kelp beds and mangroves and seagrasses, which are incredibly important for storing carbon, as well as these marine protected areas provide coral reef protections and other storm resilience. So we see the more protections we have, we can make sure that as these warming seas can create in places more intense storms, and we need to protect communities from hurricanes and typhoons around the globe. So increasing this protection to an amount that would adequately secure the future of marine biodiversity, protect communities, ensure that we have food sources. So much of the world depends on the marine resources for their sources of protein in their daily diets. So marine protected areas and getting to protect at least 30% of the planet is incredibly important for climate, important for biodiversity, for habitat, for food, and for storm protection. So a lot of opportunities that we have to increase protections to meet those targets.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a really important policy, definitely, to build, like you said, resilience for both people and for our planet. And kind of talking about the fisheries and the impact of that, we've seen, I think, with the 2023 octopus bloom. I actually managed to experience it firsthand. I went down to Cornwall, I went and did some diving and saw 2 octopuses, both of which outside of their little dens had just crab legs and lobster kind of remains, which was really fun to see, but obviously not great for the fishers who are down there, who rely on fishing crab and lobster for their livelihoods. And I wondered if we could come to you, Katie, to talk a bit about how those local ecosystems are affected, both in Cornwall, but also with respect to your broader research more globally, how we can see how, oceans which don't feel as connected to our countries actually affect the livelihoods of people living alongside them.
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, so the octopus, we hear lots about the octopus, especially living in the southwest.
Yeah.
The main reason they've managed to kind of maintain the populations that they've maintained at the moment is because the last couple of years we haven't had a cold winter. So it's not necessarily to do with warm summers, it's more to do with warm winters, because it takes a cold water snap to kind of reduce the populations.
Okay.
But so that's kind of why we've got the number of octopus we've had, because as Zoe mentioned.
Sorry, just coming on that. So why is the reason why we're not getting those cold snaps, is that related to ocean, just to climate change in general, or is that particular kind of broader weather pattern we're just seeing over the last few years?
Zoe can probably add more to that, but I think it's a combination. So we've got the broader climate change, but we've been having, I think Zoe mentioned earlier, the heat waves that we've been experiencing around the UK this year in particular. They've kind of continued all the way through winter. So although we don't necessarily recognise them in quite the same way, the media doesn't, and they're less spoken about when heat waves happen in the winter. Our water temperatures didn't drop to the same low levels that they normally drop to in winter over the previous, like the winter we've just had, or the year before that. So yeah, it's where they're kind of sitting at this slightly higher temperature than we'd expect, which often is still classified as marine heat wave.
Okay.
But yeah, is a combination of things. Did you want to add into that quickly, Zoe, or no?
Oh, that's only great.
Okay, cool. But apart from that, yeah, I mean, if we look at some of the fisheries impacts that we've seen all over the place, America is a great example, directly as a result of marine heat waves. Up in Alaska, the snow crab fishery, which is worth over 100 million per year, has been closed. The cod fishery in the similar area was closed for multiple years following marine heat waves. And several other fisheries as well have all been closed. And there's lots and lots of towns that are built directly on fisheries and the fishing industry. So there's been entire towns where essentially their entire income for the season has gone. And a lot of this is because of if you think about the life history of different species, so it's not necessarily one individual being hit by the temperature. It can be that individual survives, but it doesn't manage to reproduce that year. It might be that because the rest of the food chain is being impacted as well, the food isn't available for the different animals to carry on reproducing and creating new populations. So the cod fishery, for example, the most direct link they found through the heat waves, that the marine heat waves changed the plankton communities. So the tiny zooplankton in the water column were changing, and they were shifted from being quite fatty, quite energetically rich cold water species to much less energetically rich, much smaller tropical species instead. And this meant that the small fish weren't getting much food, so they didn't grow. And then you kind of worked through the food chain, and there was multiple impacts where, as you got further through the food chain, there was less nutrients, less nutrition, I guess, available from the step before because of that top level. And then we see some other things. I mean, so Peru is a really interesting case where the Peruvian anchovy fisheries provides 20% of fish meal and fish oil to the globe, and it's worth billions of pounds. When we had the most recent big heat wave in 2023 that kind of affected the globe, and if you think now, while we're in this El Nino year at the moment, currently I had a look at the statistics today, and 1/3 of our global oceans are sitting in a marine heat wave right now. So that's a huge amount. But the fishery species there, the anchovies, move offshore because that's where the cooler water is, which just means they're just out of range for the local boats to get to, which means that the fishery closes down. And in 2023-24, Peru lost $1.4 billion just from the anchovy fishery. So this year, they kind of tried to learn from that, and they opened the season slightly early to try and catch anchovy when the water temperatures weren't so high that the fish were moving. And although they still only got a few weeks of fishing in before they had to close the season back in February, March this year, they did manage to catch about 500,000 tons as opposed to the 3 million tons they normally catch per year. So just being slightly proactive and thinking ahead as to how they can respond to temperatures they know they're going to change has helped there.
Yeah. Wow, it's such a huge economic and financial impact, not only on the communities, but also on, the growth of these countries. And actually, I'd be interested to come to you, Brian, and get your sense of how restoring biodiversity, like what kind of sense you feel from countries that there's a financial incentive behind restoring that biodiversity and creating better resilience to events like marine heat waves when it comes to 30 by 30.
I think we're starting to see countries recognize how critical this is. I mean, you take the Pacific Island, small island developing states, all of them are the global leaders on advocating for large marine protected areas and biodiversity conservation. They recognize that we need to do two things. We need to ensure the resilience that marine protected areas provide in terms of habitat for their fisheries, coastal defense from typhoons, which are increasingly devastating in the Pacific, and also to make sure that they are opportunities to work on climate change. These systems absorb carbon, and so they want to make sure that these kelp beds and seagrasses and mangroves are either protected or, in cases where they have been degraded, restored. And so you see global leaders coming from these Pacific Island states, as well as in the Caribbean. I was recently talking to the environment minister from Jamaica, and they had a devastating hurricane last summer. I think it was actually September of last year. And they talked about how important the reefs and conservation were, and biodiversity conservation was for protecting the inhabitants of Jamaica. And so they continue to be advocates for both the marine protection areas and resilience provided by the conservation of marine habitat, but also they recognize that protecting habitat alone won't solve this. We also have to deal with the emissions issue, and to recognize that that these go hand in hand. Marine conservation is a key moment both to ensure biodiversity and to absorb carbon, but we cannot continue to add more and more carbon to the atmosphere and expect the ocean to be able, just by marine protected areas alone, to solve this. So we need to do both. We need to act on the climate side of the equation while we're also acting on the habitat and the resilience side of the equation of the ocean.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting to hear how the Jamaican government's kind of responded to that. With a lens on a view on biodiversity. We've had a question from Cecilia, who said, in terms of habitat restoration and resilience, how should restoration practitioners for kelp, reef, seagrass should they plan projects with El Niños and marine heat waves in mind? I don't know who might be best placed to answer that. Brian, I saw you were nodding there. Maybe we can offer it up to you.
I do think this is a challenge we're facing. Conservation in maybe 50 years ago was able to plan and think of a somewhat static world, even though we know it's changing, but not changing as rapidly as it is now. And so we were able to design protected areas or reefs around what we thought was going to be a consistent range of temperatures or a type of habitat that it would support. But increasingly, we're seeing rapid changes in temperatures and in ecosystems. And so we need to think about not only where things are now, but where they're likely to be in the future. Mm-hmm. Some of that is going to be very hard to predict. As we've seen the changes, I think in some ways outpace our expectations of where we thought climate change was going to be impacting and how rapidly some of the marine ecosystems. So in that regard, I think we need to protect more, right? That means that we need to have a resilience and redundancy in our systems to make sure that we have a broad range of habitats. So for migratory species can survive in different temperatures. We need to also recognize that some of the temperatures that we're planning for now are going to be very different in the really short term. So spending a lot of money to restore an ecosystem that may not survive in a certain temperature scenario may not be the worth investment. So we need to look at not only where this is now, but what it's likely to be in the future. So engaging with scientists to do that climate modeling, temperature modeling, species modeling of what will exist there, what's going to thrive in these other temperatures is important before we embark in restoration initiatives.
Mm-hmm. I saw you nodding there, Zoe, and you've been part of a report that's looked to spotlight for the 40 important zones with regards to marine heat waves. Is that kind of the right characterization? Would you be able to tell us a bit more about that and your process, I guess, for where we find these areas of importance and why it's critical to outline them?
So that was the 40 priority questions that.
Yes. Sorry.
Yeah. So no. This report came out recently, but it came from a group we got together a few years ago after I think it was after the 2023 heat wave, was it, Katie? And this was when kind of marine heat wave research was relatively new in the UK. So I tried to get a kind of group of lots of different scientists and government officials together to try and figure out what the priority questions are, because as we've said, we haven't really experienced them that much around the UK. But as Katie's been saying, we do know that around the world they can have really awful negative impacts. So it's just something we need to try and figure out what the impacts are likely to be around the UK. And that's thinking across the board. So not just what are the impacts on fisheries, what are the impacts on our kind of restoration projects and things like that, but going a bit further afield and starting to thinking about potential impacts on people, on livelihoods, how can we improve our evidence collecting through like greater monitoring and using different techniques to try and understand exactly what this kind of new normal may look like for us in future, so that we can really start to try and adapt and try and protect our marine environment as much as we can before it does become a problem. So again, like I said earlier, try to be proactive about this before something really bad does happen and we start to experience negative consequences.
And how professionally, how do you find, coming from, I guess, not a blind spot, but a definite lack of data in terms of these marine heat waves and the adverse effects they're having on our wildlife. How are you finding that and navigating, we've had one in 2023, we've had quite a serious one in 2026, the increased frequency we're having them, and how we're going to have to be dealing with this in future?
It's quite tricky. It's really difficult because we're not really set up for kind of long-term monitoring to really understand what's happening to anything around the UK. So it's really important when we start thinking about the impacts of a marine heat wave. A marine heat wave is just an extreme event. So we kind of need to know what's been happening. I don't know, Katie, what would you say, over the last 10 years or so in like normal conditions, what's happening during the marine heat wave, and then what's happening afterwards, to really be able to pinpoint the impact of the marine heat wave, as opposed to gradual warming or overfishing or any other kind of pressures that might be happening. So yeah, we really need to kind of increase our long-term monitoring of all kinds of things. So the physical environment, understanding what's happening beneath the surface, because we have a very good picture of what's happening at the surface with our satellites providing these lovely temperature maps that you probably see more frequently. We don't really know as much what's going on underneath the surface because we're just lacking that kind of long-term monitoring of what's going on there. And of course, that's where most of our marine life resides. So that's really important. And then also setting up monitoring of our ecosystems and our fisheries to really try and understand what's going on.
And on that monitoring point, we've got a question here from Natalie, who is a surfer, and she's currently collecting sea surfing temperature using HOBO device every time she goes surfing in Portugal with another surfer, doing it in Nova Scotia. So they've got loads of data, but how do they find the most impactful way to analyse and share their findings as concerned citizen scientists?
That is a very good question. So I'm an ocean modeler, so I don't really deal too much with data. I look at large data sets, but I think if you have any data, there will be people. Feel free to email me directly, and I'll definitely put you in touch with the right people so that we can use this data. Because as you say, this is really important. I think citizen science in particular is a very important aspect here of how we can start collecting more data on all kinds of things, not just sea temperature, which, by the way, is very useful, but on all kinds of other things. I don't know if Katie or Brian wants to come in on that one.
Yeah, I can just, again, I unfortunately can't tell you straight offhand where this data would be best given, I guess, but you're absolutely right that this kind of data is really important. So for example, if we look on the satellite maps right now, we know that parts of the channel are reaching around 20 degrees Celsius, but I know from friends who were diving yesterday off Plymouth Sound, and they recorded on their dive computers 21.7 degrees Celsius at the surface, which is a huge difference and makes a really big difference to what we're seeing and what we're experiencing. So yeah, Natalie, it'd be really good actually if you did email Zoe or myself, and we will try and work our hardest basically to try and work out the best route for this kind of thing, because I think it's so important to try and get any measures we can get out for knowledge, basically, for us to be able to work out exactly what's happening in much more pinpoint situations. Because one of the problems we have, and again, Zoe could probably talk about this more, but when we use the satellite, especially the long baseline satellite data, we essentially get one temperature reading for around a 25 kilometre square grid of the ocean. So once you get close to the coast, it gets a lot harder to determine what the actual temperatures are. And realistically, we know that you get a huge amount of variability as you go up and down the coast or as you go slightly further offshore. But because just the clarity that we get from satellite records, it's really hard to try and determine what the exact temperatures are that we're seeing.
Nice. Well, good we can facilitate some citizen science on our roundtable. Pretty exciting. We've got loads of questions in the chat. We've got another one from Charlie, who would like to know a bit more about the Cornwall octopuses, and are these migrant species successfully integrating into the new ecosystems, or are they acting like invasive species and driving out the native species existing there? Katie, maybe you could tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, I can, and that's it. It's been quite an interesting roller coaster, I guess, with the octopus. And we've got a few people at my work that work quite heavily on trying to work out what's happening, because they're still relatively new, I don't think we have a clear picture of whether they are integrating or, you know, whether they're displacing other species, things like that. But what we have seen recently is that some of the other species that they're eating are developing new habits to try and avoid the octopus. So where they initially came in and were really damaging for the shellfisheries and things like that, some of the species, like for example, I've heard about lobsters working out how to hide from them and things like that. So I think, yeah, we're going to have to see over the next few years exactly how things are changing for that.
Very interesting. I guess let's come back to you, Brian, and we've zeroed in there on quite like, you know, grassroots activism. And the 30 by 30 framework is kind of, as you explained, really important in creating the resilience for these ecosystems. We don't always get, I mean, we're halfway through the ocean decade, and we don't always get the best statistics coming out of MPAs in terms of full protection. Can you give us your sense of where we are at with the 30 by 30 target and how hopeful you are that it will be able to provide the resilience and work as a policy to help safeguard against things like marine heat waves?
Sure. So the global leaders agreed to this 30 by 30 target to protect at least 30% of the world's lands and ocean by 2030. Back in 2021, they agreed to this at the Convention on Biological Diversity in Montreal, and it was a global target. Since then, we've gone from about 8% of the ocean protected to about just over 10% of the ocean protected, although the degree of protection under that 10% varies. Only a relatively small percentage of that is protected in a way that prohibits overfishing. So we need to get both. We need to grow that number to 30%, and we also need to make sure the quality of protection increases, and we need to make sure it's done in the right places. In terms of getting there, there's some hopeful news. For instance, we had a high seas treaty that I know you covered on one of your previous round tables. So we have a legal framework for the first time in which nations can come together and protect marine biodiversity on the high seas. That didn't exist before just a few years ago. So that's an exciting development. We're also seeing countries develop their planning strategies. So each country now is going through and looking at their own ocean estates and what they can protect. What are the areas they can protect and how they should get there. And if you add those all the way up, we are getting on the way to 30%, but not quite there based on their current plan. So we need an injection of political leadership, of political will. That means that citizens and grassroots advocates should be talking to their governments and saying we need more ambition, we need faster action. And importantly, we need finance, because the real way to make sure these areas are protected is an injection of resources, both public resources from governments as well as philanthropic resources, to make sure that these areas have the ability to be planned, to be monitored. As Zoe said, we need more money for monitoring, and we need more money for enforcement. So we need to make sure that they don't just exist on paper, but there isn't illegal fishing going in there, illegal deep sea mining or other activities happening in these marine protected areas. So I am somewhat hopeful. I think there's been a good start. A number of countries have created new marine protected areas. Just last summer, we saw French Polynesia create the world's largest marine protected area at the UN Oceans Conference in Nice. That was announced. That was an exciting development. We're seeing a number of other countries do new marine protected areas, but we need more political leadership, and we need more in the UK and in Europe. We need better policies for the marine protected areas. They still allow way too many activities that are harmful for nature, including trawling, deep sea mining in some places, and overfishing in places. So we need both money and better policy in some countries.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm completely behind that. We just had a new Prime Minister come in today, I think, in the UK. So it'll be interesting to see what kind of policy he's able to drive in this area. We've got another question from Jai Chung, who is talking more about the global impact, and will these kind of extreme climate changes and rising ocean temperatures accelerate sea rise? How significant would those numbers be? And if this extreme climate change continues, how will rising sea temperatures around the UK spread across the rest of the world? That might be best placed maybe for you, Zoe. Is that more of like kind of what data-wise, what kind of response can you give from that?
Yeah, so I'm not necessarily an expert in sea level, but these kind of extreme temperatures, so one of the main modes of sea level rise is from thermal expansion. So the warmer the water kind of expands, and therefore you're getting the sea level rise that we see at the surface. So these marine heat waves, so if you think about, especially around the UK, in the English Channel and the southern North Sea, so these are some of the regions that are being hit at the moment by the marine heat wave. These regions are quite shallow. The warm anomaly has actually gone the whole way down to the sea floor, so there's not really anywhere for this heat to escape. Therefore, these regions, I imagine we would be seeing the kind of greatest sea level rise down there. Sorry, what was the other half of the question? I'm trying to scroll and find it.
It's about, I've lost it now as well. Oh, here. How would rising sea temperatures spread across the rest of the world?
Yeah, so it's important to remember that these are seasonal impacts that we're seeing at the moment. So the UK shelf seas are very seasonally driven seas. At the moment, we're seeing, we would normally be seeing stratified seas where we have the kind of warm, very warm kind of lid, if you like, in the upper few meters, and then the cooler water beneath. Because this marine heat wave has been going on for a while, and as I've said, in the shallower regions, it's definitely reaching greater depths. It's making it harder to dissipate. However, we are around the UK mostly driven by what's happening in the overlying atmosphere. Not entirely. So we have impacts coming in off the shelf from ocean currents and things like that as well. But particularly in the North Sea and the Channel, for example, we're kind of seeing what's happening in the atmosphere. So if we start seeing a change in our weather, these kind of warm anomalies are going to get mixed away, and everything will kind of dissipate. There's a chance the anomaly may stay beneath the surface and kind of re-emerge, which is kind of what we've seen in recent months where we've been hit with these kind of successive heat waves. It kind of disappears from the surface for a bit because it's just gone. Oh, sorry, there's a huge boat outside. The problems of working in a dockgate. But the anomaly can then just kind of rise back up to the surface. So it's a seasonal situation. It's likely going to get mixed away when we have our winter storms coming in, rather than kind of spread laterally out into the open Atlantic, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that does make sense. And I'm aware of time, so we'll just have a few more questions. But we've got one from Cecilia here that I think is an interesting mix of the different dynamics we've sort of talked about here. It seems difficult to balance the large-scale action and restoration activity needed to ensure ecosystem resilience, whilst also acting on robust data and long-term monitoring, as mentioned. How do we keep progress at pace that keeps up with the degradation and climate change effects? I wondered if we come to you on this one, Katie, because of your work kind of with other organisations around the world and how different, organisations and governments are trying to keep pace with these marine heat waves and this kind of climate change.
It's really difficult questions to answer, really, because I think we're still in such an infancy of our knowledge globally. We don't totally understand how to do this. I think Zoe's comments on monitoring are really key, and where I've been sat on panels and things in other countries and helped write reports and things for other countries, that's come across as a really clear thing, that until we know what's actually down there, until we know exactly what our ecosystems are made up of right now and how healthy they are, it's impossible for us to kind of work out how things are going to change going forward. So I've got a cat and children just outside my window here, playing around. Girls, can you go away, please? Thanks. Sorry. School holidays have just begun, so it's a bit crazy. It's a really difficult thing to do, and I think where Brian's been talking about, the more area we can protect, the better, because we still don't know exactly where some of these major impacts are going to be, or where an event's suddenly going to rear its ugly head. If I think about some of the overseas locations that have been really impacted, one of the first ones that comes to my mind is when the term marine heat wave was first kind of coined, when people first started using it, it was following this huge event off the west coast of Australia, and there was several major impacts. One was that an area called Shark Bay lost a huge amount of its seagrass. So the repercussions with regard to fisheries, nursery grounds, carbon sequestration, all these different things were huge. But there was also a huge area of the coast that lost all its kelp forests. And that was 100 kilometres of kelp forest, 100 kilometres of coastline, which had kelp forest that lost it in 2011. And we now wind forward 15 years and it hasn't regrown anywhere. So what they've had to do out there instead is adapt, what is the new norm for them. And for the last 15 years, it has no longer been that kelp forests are in that location. So rather than, as I think I've been chatting briefly about, rather than trying to restore in a way that is no longer feasible in different environments, we need to be looking to the future and trying to work out, what native species do we have if we're trying to restore an area that will be surviving these warmer temperatures that we're seeing more and more. Yeah, I think it's a real difficult balancing act at the moment.
Yeah, it does certainly seem like, difficult to plan for a future when you have very little, I guess, knowledge base to work on. So as Brian said, let's just get as much of it protected as possible and see what we can do from there. On to my final question, which is more of a roundup question. But it would be great to hear if there's one takeaway one urgent takeaway you'd want our audience to have from this session about marine heat waves, either something you feel like isn't communicated as well, some way of looking forward with these issues, or some impact you think is understated. Zoe, if I come to you first, that would be great.
Yes, I'm going to go straight back into our urgent need for monitoring. We're struggling to get funding for the kind of long-term monitoring because we won't see the impact of that for years down the line. So I would actually like to lean on something that's come up in this discussion, and I'd really would like to see some kind of citizen science programs here, trying to collect data from these kind of different sources that are so important. I think that would be my takeaway.
And Katie, what about you?
Similar. I totally agree with the citizen science. Monitoring, I think the monitoring is key, but it's also just this recognition of not just what we're seeing here, but taking away the understanding of how different other parts of the world are impacted, because I think we've got so much to learn from that. And until we start to kind of grasp the major impacts that you can see in other areas of the world, which we will see in the future here. Don't know if it's going to be in 2 years' time or in 10 years' time, but we will be seeing similar impacts. So it's just people understanding how huge these impacts can be and thinking about where we go forward with that, I guess, from me.
And then talking about going forward to you, Brian, what would your response be?
I would say that this is an important wake-up call for all of us to recognize just how reliant we are on the systems that regulate our planet, and the ocean being the biggest one of those. And so if we value, which we should, kind of a stable climate that we can thrive in, then we need to act to make sure that continues. And so that means that we need to act on climate change, get politicians to reduce emissions and policies for that, and we need to act on ocean conservation. So encourage global targets of protecting at least 30% of the world's ocean, but also locally, what can you do locally supporting your own local marine conservation organization? So be an active citizen, vote, engage in politics, talk to the media, be a citizen scientist, as Zoe has mentioned, and others on the others who have written in. There's a lot of ways you can engage. Don't get overwhelmed. It's a big challenge, and it can feel overwhelming, both the climate challenge and the biodiversity loss challenge at once. But if you take your actions as a voter and as an engaged citizen and as an individual, you can make a real difference if we do this collectively.
Well, that is a lovely and constructive note to end this discussion on. And thank you all for joining me and for having such a vital and rich discussion. It's been super interesting and great to have you on. If you've enjoyed this discussion and would like to see more of what Oceanographic has to offer, there should be a discount popping up soon on the screen, which you can get a discounted subscription using. But thank you all for watching. Thank you for joining me, and see you next week at the same time on the same link. So yeah, thanks so much, guys. Have a good rest of your day.